Genesis chapter 30. Now, when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said to Jacob, "Give me children, or else I will die." And Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God who has withheld you from the fruit of the womb?" So she said, "Here is my maid Bilhah, go into her, and she will bear child on my knees, that I also may have children by her." Then she gave him Bilhah, her maid, as wife, and Jacob went into her. This is quite interesting. Genesis 31 to 4. You can see Rachel, the chosen one, the beautiful wife, the one who Jacob agreed to do extra 7 years for, all of a sudden was envious of her sister, the unloved one, the one who was a mistake. Why? Because God had shot her womb, because Jacob did not show love to Leah, like we read in 29. So this brought envy that Leah was having children and she, the chosen one, wasn't having children. So she went to Jacob. She said to Jacob, "Now listen, you have to give me children or I will die." Simply stated. Jacob was very angry about this because there was tension in the family. And Jacob knew that the hand of God was in charge of all of this. Jacob, if no other person, understood that children come from God. He saw that with his father, because his grandparents, Abraham and Sarah, waited years before they had his father Isaac, and also Isaac also waited years before he had Jacob and Esau. So Jacob understood one thing: children comes from God. So what happened instead? Rachel decided, like, okay, why don't you now take my maidservant, Bilhah, and have kids with her? Now Rachel understood that this was the same thing Hagar did with Abraham. It was some kind of a surrogate mother type of arrangement. So Rachel gave her maid Bilhah to Jacob for the sake of bearing a child, and the Bible said Jacob went into her. So we continue from 5. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, "God has judged my case, and he has also heard my voice and given me a son." Therefore, she called his name Dan. She called his name Dan. Now, Jacob's 5th son, born to him through Bilhah, the maid of Rachel, was named Dan, meaning judgment. Because of her own envy, she viewed this child born by a human scheme as a victory over a kind of a victory and a vindication for her. And she said, "God has judged my case." So Rachel felt that the birth of Dan was a proof that God heard her complaints. So she felt strengthened in the competition against her sister Leah. So we continue from 7. And Rachel made Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, "With this great wrestling, I've wrestled with my sister, and indeed I've prevailed." So she called his name Naphtali. So Rachel called his name Naphtali. So Jacob's 6th son, born to him through Bilhah, the maid of Rachel, was named Naphtali. Rachel gave this name, meaning to wrestle, because the relationship in her home had broken down to the point where Rachel openly acknowledged that there was a competition, a kind of baby competition. So she had to wrestle. This is strange because at this point, Leah had 4 sons and Rachel, through Bilhah, had 2 sons. Yet, Rachel said that she had prevailed. Perhaps, maybe she meant that in the sense that now Leah seemed to have stopped having children. We'll find out as we continue from 9. When Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her to Jacob as a wife. And Leah made Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, "A troop comes," and she called his name Gad. So you could see here, Zilpah, now the maid of Leah, was given over to Jacob. So Leah who had stopped bearing children, decided that she could use the same surrogate mother, type of arrangement, to increase the number of her children. I mean, Rachel is doing the same thing. So therefore, she brought her maid to Jacob and gave her maid to Jacob, as Rachel did. So Zilpah bore a son who happened to be Jacob's seventh son, born to him through Zilpah, and Leah named him Gad, meaning troop or good fortune. So the wife of Jacob, continued to see their children as a pawn in a power struggle within the home. Leah had apparently lost the peace she had when her fourth son was born. She no longer had the peace, that Judah brought, because of Rachel was continually wrestling with her. We continue from 12. And Leah made Zilpah bore a second son. Then Leah said, I am happy, for the daughters will call me blessed. So she called his name Asher. Jacob's eighth son, born to him through Zilpah, the maid of Leah, was named Asher, meaning happy. Leah was more concerned about her status, of having more children, because she said, all the daughters will call me blessed. So she was very more concerned of her status, because like I said, competition was going on. We continue in 14. It says, now Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, it is a small matter that you have taken away my husband. Would you take away my son's mandrake also? And Rachel said, therefore he will lie with you tonight for your son's mandrake. When Jacob came out of the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, you must come in to me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrake. And he lay with her that night. And God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore a son. She bore Jacob's fifth son. Leah said, God has given me my wages, because I have given my maid to my husband. So she called his name Issachar. So you see, mandrakes, Reuben, this root crop, kind of like a love apple in Hebrew. It was thought that this mandrake increases fertility in women, and still to date, people use it. Now, because Leah had this mandrake, remember, Leah has stopped having children, so she needed to go take mandrakes to kind of like increase her fertility. Now, when she took this mandrake, which Reuben brought to her, she knew that if she takes this mandrake, perhaps there'll be chance of her having kids or bearing another child biologically of her own. So what happened? Rachel came for this mandrake, and she was angry. She told Rachel that you, the loved wife, you've taken my husband away from me. Remember, Leah was given to Jacob firstly, but Leah still sees Jacob as her husband. And she was like, you have taken away my husband. She told that to Rachel, the loved one. So you could see this tension and hostility that was obvious between a hurting Leah and also Rachel. So it must have been very terrible to live under this roof, So what happened? Rachel took the mandrake, and Leah went to Jacob and said, listen, I've paid for your services tonight. You must come into me, and Jacob obliged. And then God listened to Leah. She must have been praying like Rebecca did, like Sarah did, to have a child. And God listened to her complaint, and she gave birth to a child, and she called his name Issachar, who happens to be Jacob's ninth son. So Leah gave birth to Issachar, meaning reward. So Leah saw this ninth son as a reward from God, because she was generous enough to offer her maid Zilpah to Jacob. We continue from 19. Then Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a fifth son, and Leah said, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will dwell with me because I've bore him 6 sons. So she called his name Zebulun. So Zebulun, Jacob's 10th son, born to Leah, it means dwelling. In the pain of her heart, she had waited for her husband to truly love her. She had waited for the day Jacob would look into her eyes and love her, giving Jacob 6 sons, and she felt like with Zebulun, Jacob would finally, find that in his heart to basically love her, And then we read from 21. It said, afterwards she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. She gave birth to a daughter. So after 10 children, Jacob became a father to a daughter through Leah, who was named Dinah. Apparently, there was nothing obviously symbolical or significant in her name, because these sons later on went on to be the 12 tribes of Israel. Now I continue from 22. Then God remembered Rachel. God listened to her and opened her womb. So God remembered Rachel. So whatever sin Rachel may have committed in pride or in competition with Leah, God had not forgotten her. God loved her and cared for Leah, but he also remembered Rachel. This tells us about the great God we serve. You see, whenever God remembers a thing, it comes with a move. You can see when God remembered Noah and the ark, it told him to come down. Whenever God remembers a thing, it comes with a move. So now Rachel must have been praying, because he said God listened to her. She must have been praying. Well, what is the problem? The same way Isaac prayed for Rebekah, she must have been praying, asking God for the fruit of the womb. The Bible said, and God opened her womb. So this is the idea of God's sovereignty over the womb. You could see that repeatedly in the Bible. So the purpose of God in granting children to anyone who, for whatever reason, have been denied children. You can see this happening with Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel. You can see this happening with Hannah and Elkanah. You can see this happening with Elizabeth and Zachariah. You can see God does not forget. God is the God who opens womb, according to Genesis 29:31. You see, God is the one who makes the barren to conceive. You can see that in Genesis 25:21. And God can also close womb. You can see that in 1 Samuel 1:5, and he's a God who also opens womb. Now we continue from 23 to 24. And she conceived and bore a son, and she said, God has taken away my reproach. So she called his name Joseph and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. So Joseph became the 11th son born to Jacob through Rachel. She named the name Joseph. Now, the interesting thing is the women were naming the children the name, not the man. Joseph, she called him Joseph, which means may he add. Rachel felt that although she had been vindicated by the birth of one son, but Rachel wasn't done having children. She wanted more children to continue that competition with her sister, because she said, the Lord shall add to me another son. And she called him Joseph, and then it was all because God had taken away a reproach. So at this point, one might think this 11th son would end up being the key son God would use to, further his redemptive purpose through his family. This 11th son, who is Joseph, would go on to play an important role in God's unfolding plan for the family of Jacob, but not as the one through whom the Messiah would come. God's ways are not often what we expect. His ways are far beyond the ways of man. You can find this in Isaiah 55:8-9. You can see that the ways of God is completely different. It says, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are far higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. That's impressive. Now we continue from 25 to 27. And then he says, and it came to pass when Rachel had bore Joseph, that Jacob said to Laban, send me away, that I may go to my place and to my country. Give me my wives and my children, from whom I have served you, and let me go, for you know my service which I have done for you. And Laban said to him, please stay, if I found favor in your eyes, for I have learned my experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake. So, Jacob now felt it was time to move. So he went to his uncle Laban and said, send me away that I may go to my own place and to my country. Though Jacob was in Haran, we saw that he had traveled to Haran with Laban and his daughters. He had lived there for more than 14 years because he worked seven years for each, and he stayed extra year, bringing everything to 20. So he knew that this is not the land that he belongs. This is not the promised land for God. God would give through God's covenants, with his grandfather, and with Isaac. So after 14 years, Jacob was like, okay, it's time for me to leave and return to the promised land, which is my country. But Laban told him, please stay. Laban knew Jacob was an invaluable worker for him. Laban said this knowledge was learned by experience. Literally, what Laban meant was that learned by divination. It is probable that Laban practiced occult divination, but that we'll see, because you could see later, we'll get to that. Now, by this, he knew the source of blessing. Jacob being around him and him being blessed, it wasn't ordinary. He knew something was with Jacob. Now, I continue, 28 to 34. Then he said, name your wages, and I will give it. So Jacob said to him, you know how I've served you, and how your livestock has been with me, for what you've had before. I came as little, and it has increased to a great amount. The Lord has blessed you since my coming. And now, when shall I also provide for my own house? So he said, what shall I give you? And Jacob said, you shall not give me anything. If you will do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep your flock. Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from there all the speckled and the spotted sheep, and all the brown ones among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and this shall be my wages. So my righteousness will answer for me in the time to come, when the subject of my wages comes before you. Everyone that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and brown among the lambs will be considered stolen if it is with me. And Laban said, oh, that it were according to your word. So you have a situation here, the spotted and speckled, among goats. Jacob said, this shall be my wages, and his wages from Laban. So Jacob would take the speckled and the spotted offspring, but first he had to separate the currently speckled and spotted animals from the rest of the flock. This sets the probability of more, speckled and spotted offspring against him. Now, allowing the speckled and the spotted sheep and goats to remain in the flock would increase the likelihood of more speckled and spotted offspring coming from the flock at large. Now, when Jacob told Laban this, Laban had no problem. He said, it were according to your word. This was an agreeable deal to both parties. First, it was a foolproof, kind of like to distinguish between the flocks of Laban and Jacob. As well, Laban liked the idea because the odds were set in his favor. Jacob may have proposed in this arrangement because he was trusting in God. Remember when Jacob was running to Paddan Aram, he told God, if you take me and bring me back, I will serve you. Now, 35 to 36, we read. So he removed that day the male goats that were speckled and spotted, all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had some white in it, and all the brown ones among the lambs, and gave them into the hands of his son. Then he put 3 days journey between himself and Jacob, and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flock. So Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flock. Jacob would care for the large flock of his father-in-law Laban. This one's made up of solid colored animals. Jacob, would receive any speckled or spotted offspring of his flock. So obviously, if there was a way Jacob could encourage this solid color sheep to bring forth spotted and speckled offspring, it would increase his personal wealth. So what happened after this? The Bible said Laban, he put 3 days journey between himself and Jacob. So to prevent the mixing of the flock, Laban's son took care of all the existing speckled and spotted sheep and goats, keeping them a 3-day journey from the main flock. The Bible said Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flock. So to make sure that the property of his employer was well taken care, Jacob himself took over Laban's flock. Now we read 37 to 43. Now Jacob for himself rods of green polar and of the almond and chestnut and trees peeled with white strips in them, and exposed the whites which was in the rod, and the rod which was peeled he had set before the flocks in the gutters, in the watering trough where the flocks came to drink, so that they should conceive when they came to drink. So the flock conceived before the rods, and the flocks brought forth streaked, pickled, and spotted. Then Jacob separated the lambs and made the flocks face towards the streak, and all the brown in the flock of the lamb. But he put his own flocks by himself, and did not put them with Laban's flock. And it came to pass, whenever the stronger livestock conceived, that Jacob placed the rod before the eyes of the livestock in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. But when the flocks were feeble, he did not put them in. So the feebler were Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. Thus the man became exceedingly prosperous, and had large flocks, female and male servants, and camels and donkey. Interesting. So when Jacob, put these branches in the watering trough of the flock, it apparently increased the number of speckled and spotted offspring from the solid color flock that Jacob managed on Laban's behalf. The Bible talked about the feebler were Laban's and the stronger Jacob. So Jacob also used selective breeding to increase the strength and vitality of the flock. We don't know exactly, how this method worked. It is possible Jacob knew more about animal husbandry than we do today, but it is more likely Jacob did the best he knew, and God blessed it. Now, Genesis 31, which we will read later, tells us that Jacob saw in a dream the blessed reproduction of speckled and spotted sheep and goats. That dream was also connected with a promise of God's care for Jacob and a command to return to Canaan, the land of his family. Now, the Bible talked about Jacob being exceedingly prosperous. So the ancient Hebrew ways, the man burst out exceedingly. So God blessed Jacob, but it was not because Jacob was an especially good person or someone who was extraordinary. It was because of the promises God made to Jacob. When we read Genesis 28, 13 to 15, and the covenant made to Abraham. In the same way, blessing comes from the Lord to his people, not because they are great or good or righteous, but because of the covenant God has made with them through Jesus, and the many promises is given to his people in his word. We may note Jacob's principle for prosperity: don't make wealth your goal. Jacob's real goal was to return home. His real goal wasn't to make wealth. His real goal was to return home, as we saw in 25 and 26 of Genesis 30. So it's important to trust in God. And that was what Jacob did. He trusted in God when he started this journey. So guys, this is the end of Genesis 30. An interesting chapter to study, because we saw the two sons born by Bilhah, and how Rachel's frustration of Jacob not giving her a child made her to give her maid over to Jacob. And then we saw the two sons born to Zilpah, the bed of Gad. And after we saw the bed of Asher, then we could see that Leah, who we thought had stopped conceiving, was able to bear two more sons and a daughter, And then we saw that after this, Rachel herself, God listened to her and opened her womb, and she gave birth to a son, Joseph, And when Jacob had his plan completed, and everything, it was time to leave. So he went on to make an agreement with his uncle Laban, because he knew it was time to go back to Canaan. And that is why, as children of God, we must know when it's time to go back to where God has called us. And the important thing was that God blessed Jacob, greatly, and increased his wealth, because God kept his promise, the promise he made to Jacob, the promise he made to Abraham. So guys, until the next chapter, stay safe and may God bless you.